One of the coolest new features we can use with CSS3 is gradients. While you might be used to using something like Photoshop to create perhaps a background gradient, you can now do this in modern browsers. That means excluding Internet Explorer, unfortunately. You can do this all with CSS. So let's open up our editor. We have a blank page. Once again, let's create a box and we'll have it say hello. There we are. Now we're going to go into our style.css and style it. And once again, I'm going to paste in some styling just to have a canvas to work with. There we are. And we're simply applying a width, a height, a background color, fairly simple stuff. Now I want to make this black into a gradient, maybe from black to white in this case, something a little bit extreme so that we can see it. Rule number one when using CSS gradients is to apply a default. So always set a solid color default. That way, if the browser does not understand a CSS3 gradient, it will simply use the default. Now we implement defaults by using a stacking type system. So now if I add another one, and this will be my linear gradient. When older browsers like Internet Explorer 8 or 7, they'll come across this and they'll say background is black, so it applies that color. Then it comes to background linear gradient and it'll go, I don't know what that is. I'm going to skip over it and it will stick with the black color. But when you're using a modern browser like Chrome, it sets it to black, then it comes here and says, oh, there's a linear gradient, let's use that instead. So now we can apply a handful of parameters here. The first one is going to be the direction. Is it going from left to right? Is it going top to bottom? Is it perhaps a 45-degree angle? Let's make it from top to bottom. Next, it wants to know what is the starting color, and that'll be black. And finally, what is the ending color? We decided on white. So let's see how that looks. If I reload it, what's going on here? We're not seeing anything. We know that browsers support linear gradients, so why can I not see it here? And that's because it's important to remember with these CSS3 properties, not all browsers support the official syntax. And that's why we learned about using prefix-sized versions. So in this case, I'm going to run it through prefixer.com using the API that we learned about in the previous lesson. And you'll see that, unfortunately, we get a bunch of parameters here, but it's better than having to write this on your own. Now, if I reload the page, we are getting that effect. So let's go over some of these. This is a little scary. We have WebKit, then WebKit again, then Mozilla, then what is Microsoft? All right, let's go through these one by one. Back in the day, not too long ago, but in terms of the web, it was a while ago, when WebKit first started experimenting with gradients, they had their own syntax. And it was this one, WebKit gradient. You specify whether it's a linear or a radial gradient. Then you specify the beginning location. In this case, we're setting it left top, or essentially the top left corner. And then it's going to end at left bottom. So that's just a way of saying go from top to bottom. And then we say it's going to go from black to white. All right. Well, Mozilla piggybacked off of WebKit's experiments, and they created a much more simplified version. Specify the direction, the beginning color, and the ending color. And this is what eventually was adopted and recommended. So shortly after, WebKit came around and provided support for the new version. Now, O, this is support for Opera. MS is support for Microsoft or Internet Explorer. And notice at the bottom, we always place the official version at the bottom. This is important. You could probably get away with putting it in here, but it's always a best practice, place it at the bottom to make sure that it takes precedence over anything else if it is supported. Now, in our case, if you are only working with WebKit, we could remove Microsoft, Opera, Mozilla, and even the old version of WebKit. And if I were to reload, that's still going to work. But if we view this in Firefox, and we'll switch over to that right now, you can see, wait, we have that big black box again. And that's why we provide the prefix versions for all of them. And that way we can make sure this gradient shows up in as many browsers as possible. In this case, in Firefox, it understands this one. And if I reload, now you can see that taking shape. Very, very cool. Once again, when creating your style sheets, I like to do it the official way and then backtrack at the end using Prefixer. So let's take a look at some other things we can do. We can add additional color stops. So I can say, I want you to go from black and then red and then green. For example, in Firefox, it starts at black, then it transitions to red, then it transitions to green. If I were to add one more, like yellow, again, it will figure out how that should work. But what if we want to state exactly where those transitions should occur? So I could say black, and then by 50%, I want you to be at red. And then green, I want you to be at 90% green. And then we're going to go to, say, yellow. Now do note, even though I have these others, they're going to be disregarded. So I could even delete those for the time being. Now if I load, you can see that we are controlling exactly where those transitions occur. So if we're smart about this, we can do some neat things. Bring this down and we'll say start at black, and then I want you to be at red by 50%. But watch what happens if I set another color at that exact value, and then we'll say go to yellow. If I reload, you can see this is how we create hard edges or straight lines. So this is fairly common. We could do something like, let's be a grayish color up to 50%, but then we're going to create a line and go to white, and we'll end it at white. You can see that now we have an edge from gray to white. Now you can't see that because the background of our body is white as well. So let's set a background of gray so we can see this more easily. And now we've created edges, and this is a neat trick to have. Next, let's take a look at some more stylistic things that we can do. I'm going to switch this to WebKit so we can return to Chrome. And now let's do a left to right gradient, and we're going to add some edges that you might find a Photoshop designer doing. So the first step is, let's replace all of this. This time it's going to go left to right from red to green. There we are. But now I want a sharp edge in the middle. So I want to say red, and I want you to be at red at 50%. And that'll make sure no matter what, we have red going to 50%. As you can see right there. At the 50% mark, it's exactly red, and then it begins to transition to green. If I were to switch that to 90, you can see what we're doing there. So now, 50% red. Next, I want to say green will be exactly 50% as well. So what we're doing here is we're stating the color and the percentage at which it should be that exact color. Not a shade of it, that color. So when we say we want exact red at 50% and exact green at 50%, it has no choice but to create a solid line, as you can see right here. So if we then want to provide accents, we can do things like this. We'll do red at 50%, then let's just do a different color, like yellow at 50%, then orange at 51%, and then green at 51%. And what this gives us is the ability to specify lines. Now, of course, in this case, that's really intense. You wouldn't want these drastic colors. But if you're a designer and you use more subtle colors like a gray to a slightly darker gray, you can create some really neat effects. So in this case, let's go into Photoshop, and now we're going to specify a color slightly darker, something like this. I'll come back and replace yellow with that color. Let's see what we get. All right, so now we have a darker edge to our red. Now let's do the green. And here we'll specify a base color, something like that. So let's copy that value, paste it in. And then I want to get something that's slightly lighter. So we'll choose this one right here for the example. Now, if we reload, we have red. It gets a little bit darker. Then we have a lighter shade of green, and then it gets lighter. And you can see we can create that inset kind of look. Now, if you require even harder edges, you can experiment with things like doing 50.1, just something that's not that exact value. And now if I reload, you can see that we have a much sharper red to darker to lighter green to green. And this is a way that you can be really creative when adding your gradients. Once again, we're taking something that was made for gradients, but using it for a different purpose. This exact concept is used by some designers to create equal height columns for their web pages, so that's a neat trick to have. Lastly, let's take a look at how we can apply this background to the body itself. So right here, we'll say linear gradient top from E3, E3, E3 to white. And then once again, I'm gonna run this all through Prefixer, like so. And now we're getting something a little bit odd. Why is this? And it's because we're applying the gradient to the body itself. So once this content completes, the body is finished, and you can see that it repeats itself. So that's not right. How can we fix this? Well, one way to fix this, and the way we'll take a look at today, is to state the height of the body element. So right here I could say, make sure that the minimum height of the body and the HTML element is 100%. Now if I reload, you can see that that stretches as much as possible, and we have a nice gradient background using no images, only CSS3.